Hello, my name is Graham Smith. I'm Newcastle University's Professor of Oral History and I currently lead the Oral History Unit in Collective. We'll be joined on HIS 2219 in 2020 by Alison Atkinson Phillips, who's a member of the Collective, was a researcher on the unit and is now the lecturer at Newcastle in Public History. These are contact details. You can always come back to this slide and have a look and see when we are contactable. This may change given the current state of the pandemic. Okay, I guess what you really want to know about is the assessment. So you'll be pleased to know it's examined solely by assessed work. There is no exam, and there's in two parts. There's two assessments. The first is a group portfolio due on the 18th of December 2020. And that consists of a 1 hour recorded interview, one transcription, one 7 to 10 minute presentation. And we'll talk about these elements and components as we go along. There's a support built into the module as the weeks pass. The group's work itself will be done in pairs. There's a certain amount of choice with your group, but each pair needs one person who's willing to do the interview. You'll be given a group mark, but if there's a case that one person isn't pulling their weight, this will be revised. It's up to you to make me aware of this. Group work will mainly take place in weeks 6 and 7, and the portfolio is due in week 8. Please remember, it is group work. Assessment, second assessment, 2,000 word essay, Friday 15th January 2021. You'll need to have access to all the recorded interviews for the module, and then you'll need to use them. In the essay. We'll provide access to the interviews, we hope. Essay question is available in the handbook, but feel free to create your own in consultation with either myself or Alison. Okay, so I thought I might begin with a definition of activist, and as we go through the module, hopefully we'll begin to challenge this particular definition, which is a person who believes strongly in political or social change and takes part in activities such as public protest to try to make this happen. The reason for giving you this definition is that activists and activism will be the topic for this year's module. So activism is contemporary, and as we can see here, over the last period, we've seen a number of major demonstrations, including the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in London and elsewhere. This one in particular was large, and this is the counter demonstrations that we saw as well in response. This is some individuals protecting a monument that no one is actually attacking, but is part of that movement. But we shouldn't forget that political activism isn't subject simply to the right wing or left wing of politics, but also the political centre. These are some of the biggest demonstrations around the EU last year. Okay. So activism, of course, is not new. The 200th anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre was last year. On 16th of August 1819, a meeting of peaceful campaigners for parliamentary reform was broken up in Manchester Yeomanry, a local force of volunteer soldiers. Between 10 and 20 people were killed and hundreds more injured in what quickly became known as the Peterloo Massacre. Although different sources give different estimates of both the numbers attending the meeting and the numbers killed and injured, it seems likely around 100,000 people attended this demonstration at St Peter's Fields in Manchester, according to the British Library's commentary on the event. But Britain has a long history of turbulent activism and protest, a thread that can be traced back to at least what Tyler's Rebellion or the Great Rising of 1381. By the way, the revolt had a variety of causes, and these included the socio-economic and political tensions that had been generated by the Black Death some 40 years earlier. And you can see how demonstrations and protest and political action can be the result of long-term development as well as short-term crisis. and yet the story of uprising tends to attract less attention than warfare or politics, even after the turn to cultural histories of everyday life, and I'll come back to that towards the end. We are, however, likely to have a better idea of popular activism in earlier periods through historians who have built on the work of E.P. Thompson, Christopher Hill, George Ruddy, Eric Hobsbawm, C.L.R. James, Antonia Raeburn, or Alison Light. And here we can see some of that sort of selective historiography in a timeline. And I think for me, one of the most important books actually, or histories produced that begins this process of thinking about activists is The Black Jacobins, first published in 1938, and actually changed the way that colonial history was written. Its author, C.L.R. James, would later recall his motivations for writing this history book, that he was tired of hearing about Africans being oppressed, decided to write a book making people of African descent the active subjects of their own history, instead of the passive objects of other people's history. According to Rachel Douglas, who provides an introduction to C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, again in the British Library. I think it's a really useful resource, by the way, for anybody looking at activists and activism. Some of the materials that the British Library produce, they're actually really good. Other players in this would be George Ruddy and E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson's probably still well known, George Ruddy less so, I guess, but Ruddy was much more prolific and actually probably more influential in terms of writing activist histories. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, published in 1968, was predated some at least 13 years by George Ruddy's The Gordon Riots, a study of rioters and their victims. But both were very much interested in subaltern histories, of histories that were hidden, and experiences particularly of social class that were hidden. Ruddy and Hobsbawm would go on to write Captain Swing together. Eric Hobsbawm, another well-known labour historian of the period. So you see this new history emerging in the late 60s, early 70s, that starts to focus on the crowd, the everyday activist, rather than elite histories and top-down history. So George Ruddy, as early as 1959, had produced The Crowd in the French Revolution. And then in 1964, The Crowd in History, a study of popular disturbances in France and England. All of these authors are well worth giving a read, and I think are still worth looking at, because they tell us so much about trying to get inside the mentality of the activist during periods of upturn and social change. Christopher Hill's The World Turned Upside Down, Radical Ideas During the English Revolution, took that a step further and started to think about, well, how does that mentality then produce particular philosophical strands of historic change, of thinking about historic change. So we begin to understand the consciousness of activists through the work of Hill in particular. I should make the point at this stage that Hobsbawm was hostile to oral history. Not all of these historians who thought about bottom-up history, of history from below, were necessarily supportive of oral history. Hobsbawm, for example, believed that personal memory is a remarkably slippery medium for preserving facts. And it's something we'll again come back to during the module. However, Antonia Raeburn, when she came to write The Militant Suffragettes, had carried out a substantive number of interviews as part of her fieldwork. That's now being digitised at the University of Plymouth for people who are interested, and includes oral histories with suffragettes recorded in the 1960s and 70s. It's a rather landmark piece of work that often goes missing in these historiographies. However, by the time we get to Alison Light in 2013, we're actually looking at something slightly different. So Alison Light's Forever England, Femininity, Literature and Conservatism Between the Wars marks not only a turn towards thinking about activists that are not just on the left, but also those across the political spectrum, but it also marks part of the cultural turn that happens. Light, by the way, along with her partner Ralph Samuel, was quite an important champion of oral history. Nevertheless, when she comes to produce her own work in the 2000s, she is really part of the what's called the cultural turn in history that accompanied an interest in literary sources. And here's a quotation from Alison's Forever England, in fact from the introduction, in which she says, "It's easy to read here the hysteria of the dispossessed, the fears of increasing egalitarianism, a reaction to the march of labour and working class activism, imagined as the onslaught of barbarians and vandals." And we tend to get this within the history of representation or the cultural turn, which is, which is much more a history from outside, partly because it's based on those literary sources. It tends to see the masses from the perspective of elites. This is not to say that oral history can address this in terms of getting directly to the experiential, to how people felt or behaved or thought at the time, but it does often remind us that what people live through might not be the same as contemporary elites' descriptions of those experiences. Oral history, if we understand the mediation of memory, may still offer a possibility of getting at how people felt in the past, how people behaved in the past, how people thought about stuff in the past, and how people acted in the past. And again, we'll talk about that within the module. Just very briefly, next in the first few weeks, we'll talk a lot about what is oral history, but just to give you an overview at this point in time, Ron Greeley described, the American oral historian Ron Greeley in 1996 described oral history as the interviewing of eyewitness participants in the events of the past for the purposes of historical reconstruction. And I want you to think about that description when we come to the first seminar, because I really want us to think about a bit more about why this might be problematic as a construction. Against that background, I just want to say something about the four phases of oral history that we've seen so far. The first was perhaps expressed best by a non-oral historian, a feminist historian called Sheila Rowbotham, who in 1973 said that oral history would allow a voice for those people otherwise hidden from history, which comes back to my point about why there's a tension perhaps between the cultural turn and oral history. And then the next phase was people began to think about how could we allow those who were interviewed to interpret their past. This eventually becomes part of what we might describe as intersubjectivity and shared authority. And again, we'll talk a wee bit more about that within the module. And could oral history empower individual or social groups was really a big question that was beginning to open up within the 1990s. But more recently, what's happened with oral history is it's encouraged a greater understanding of subjectivities, narrative, and memory. So in other words, how do people construct their past and think about their past? And I think this is a really useful approach that we can take in relation to activism and activists, is actually trying to get to grips with how people became activists, how their activism developed, and how they may have left activity. But we can certainly get that sense of trajectory through doing oral histories if we're careful. Okay, I just want to finish up by saying something about the outline of the module and also something about resources. So we've got these seminar structures really, and a lot of the talk material will be online. So rather than lectures, we've got interviews, but you'll see those as we go along, and then exercises around those interviews. But that's the structure when we meet on a weekly basis, like you can see. So in week 1, we'll be looking at what is oral history, and I'll do more of a historiography, and Alison will speak a bit more about the history of activism in Britain. The following week, Alison will then talk about mutual aid, which is a project that she's working on that we hope that you'll be able to contribute to as part of this module, but more in week 2 about that. And then there'll be a seminar by myself on memory and oral history. In week 3, we'll do much more of the practical work and think more about the equipment that we need to use and how we're going to record those interviews and how oral history interviews are best set up and conducted. On week 4, we'll think more about ethics, which are central to oral history. I mean, the difference between oral historians and historians is oral historians tend to deal with the living and historians tend to deal with the dead. We'll also have a workshop on activist interview themes and questions, so we'll develop, if you like, an interview schedule, or Alison will develop at least a thematic schedule, thinking about what we should ask about and around. In week 5, we'll do much more work on oral histories and activism. In week 6 will be the interviewing, and we'll be around to try and support that activity. So the field work, as I said, will tend to be conducted somewhere around week 6, but we'll need to be flexible, obviously, with the current emergency. Week 7 we'll offer more support on how to transcribe, interpret and present. Alison and I will sort that out between us and probably have 2 workshops. Week 8 is the assess student presentations, and we'll talk a wee bit more about that next week, or in week 1 when we actually start teaching. And also in week 12 we'll offer support for the essay and the dissertation topic as well. So the idea of this module has always been, when it's first designed by colleagues, was always to try and get you to think about how you might use oral history in your dissertation, which obviously is next year. At the end of the module, we'd hope you'd have practical experience of conducting oral history, setting up an oral history project, transcribing the interview, presenting it for public history forum, using oral histories in research. And I would hope that you'd gain some oral history theory in relation to history and memory, and overall we think this module offers very transferable skills that employers look for in graduates, and we can talk a bit more about that if you want. Dissertation ideas for next year, using oral history methodologies. We hope that will be generated through the module. Final practical matters. We need to be flexible, as I say, in a COVID world. A lot of this depends upon independent learning. There'll be set reading, which will be discussed in class, but there'll also be online presentations, online video interviews, online exercises, which we would encourage you to make your way through. I mean, it's a very unusual year, and what can we say? We're trying to make the best of it. And certainly Alison and I would both welcome feedback from you about what we're doing well and what we could really improve on. Classroom learning will be mainly discussion and workshop based, and we'll handle that collectively. Finally, I would just say that we'll see you at the next seminar.
You're going to punch properly, yeah?
First, you be out of the way, please. Chris, could you move to one side, please?